I can only speak for myself, but paying it forward, it makes me feel good, especially this time of year. And that's kind of how I think of supporting Boise State Public Radio podcasts, paying it forward. That's because we don't require any money in order to listen to our podcast. You don't have to pay a fee to hear a locked episode. You don't have to subscribe to a feed in order to hear the podcast. You can listen and share to your heart's content free of charge. But it does cost money to make these things. And if you're able to pay it forward, between now and the end of the year, we would greatly appreciate your support. If you feel so inclined, if you feel so inspired, please go to boisestatepublicradio.org right now and click that blue donate button. Any amount, any frequency, it all helps the bottom line here at Boise State Public Radio. Thanks in advance for your support. And of course, thanks for listening.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Samantha Wright, and this is Idaho Matters. Last month, Idaho Matters host Gemma Gaudette got the chance to sit down with KBOI Radio's Nate Shelman to talk about what they do as radio hosts, how they do it, and how the media landscape is changing. It was all part of a special conference put on by BoiseDev.com with help from Regions Blue Shield of Idaho and ServPro of Boise. They called it The Intersection, how Idaho and Idahoans connect the dots, and how key pieces of Idaho's economy fit together. We wanted to share their talk with you now, and we'll start by hearing from Kelly Parzell with ServPro of Boise, introducing Gretchen Parsons, the managing editor of Boise Dev. Let's take a listen.
They're both on the radio every day, but their shows have very different audiences and very different politics. Gemma Gaudette is the host of Idaho Matters on Boise State Public Radio and has hosted the show since 2018. She's a Pacific Northwest native and graduate of Murrow College of Communication at Washington State. She got her start in TV news and was the first anchor of Fox 12 News at 9 and also anchored for Channel 6 and stations in Nebraska and Florida. Nate Shelman is the host of the afternoon show on KBOI Radio, which he's hosted since 2007. He's a Cleveland, Ohio native and went to school for physical therapy before veering into radio. He started in several music formats and worked in several markets in the South and Midwest before moving to Boise. Today, they'll be taking questions from Gretchen Parsons, managing editor at Boise Dev.
Thanks, Kelly. And as Kelly said, both of you guys have very different audiences. So how would you each describe your audience?
Well, I would say I actually asked our managing person who does all of our stats about this, because I have to tell you, I don't really pay attention to who our audience is. I just do my show, in all seriousness. But what I did find out was that we're about 50% men, 50% women. And when it's live on the radio, it tends to skew a little bit older, like 35 older, but we're also on a podcast. And our podcast audience, which is actually pretty large, it skews younger. And so we have listeners, really the big chunk is 29 to 36 in our podcast listening audience, which I found to be very fascinating. And the other day, I found out that there's a young man in my son's AP biology class who listens religiously at 16 years old. And I was shocked. And in fact, when my son told me this, I said, "Are you sure it was him or the teacher?" And he was like, "Mom, he's a nerd. He listens. I don't know. I mean, your show's for old people, so I don't know why anyone would listen." But truly, that's what I know of our audience. But I really don't focus on who's listening. It's really more for me about the content.
I would describe the audience as, it didn't occur to me to bring a demographic with me. I would describe them as passionate. I would describe them as emotional. I would describe them as challenging, just across all angles as far as education goes, age groups go. When the kids call in, it's interesting when they want to be part of the show. we try to make sure a parent's nearby, especially when I put their kid on the air. But it's fun to see and hear the different groups, anyone from 70, 80 years old to somebody who is still in college calling in and wanting to be part of the conversation or offer an opinion on what we're talking about. So as far as the content, as far as the demographics goes, we're told that we should really focus on 35 to 54, but when it comes down to it, it's 35, 64. We skew a little bit, a lot toward men in that, with about 85 to 90% men in that demographic. But across all income levels, across all age levels, it's that would be the best description I could have for the KBOI audience.
And going off of that, how would you describe your show and your role?
I call myself, and I out myself on air first as an entertainer, and I put forth that, at least on the commercial band, that my goal is to keep people just listening just a little bit longer, whether it's a tease, whether it's something coming up, whether it's promoting something. But in that entertainment, you talk about things that matter. You talk about content that's relevant to people, whether it's politics, whether it's Don likes to call me out on bike lanes quite often, but whether it's something that people can, that affects them, that affects their wallet, that affects their emotion, that affects their finances, and just have fun talking about those things that matter to them.
Same question.
I would say how I describe our program is we're there to educate and to give people information and sometimes entertain. I mean, we really cover the gamut from politics to arts and entertainment and really what's going on in Idaho and how that impacts people. But I'm a big believer in the fact that our job, and I would say that, yes, I'm a journalist, but I think I get some leeway as a host to kind of be more of a moderator sometimes. And the goal is to truly inform people, to give you the information. It's not my job to sway you one way or the other. It's my job to give you information so that you can take that information and make the best decisions for yourself. So that is really the focus and the goal of our program.
And you both have been in Boise for many years. What do you think of our local information ecosystem, and how do you think it's changed?
Oh, when I first got here, it was, you had your TV stations, you had your newspaper websites, and that was it. I mean, there was radio, and that was it. I mean, that's all it was. And since then, there's been this beginning at Boise Dev. When I first got here, it didn't exist. And, neither did Idaho Education News or a lot of the other news outlets we have. The Idaho Press Tribune is now the Idaho Press, and ownership changes and fractures, and you just have this splintering that has... I'm intrigued by all of it because I get a different take from a Boise Dev. I get a more direct take from a Boise Dev, and this isn't a plug for Don or Boise Dev or anybody else, but it's just a focus that I think utilizing the resources and having the partnerships that you guys have, that others have, like Kevin Richard over at Idaho Education News or Capital Sun, it's a more interesting take because they're not all serving one master. They're serving their own lanes, and that would be one. I mean, gosh, looking at the newsrooms, I could judge and comment on a number of different media outlets, including mine. But I mean, it's at the same time, podcasts. When I first got here, podcasts, weren't as prevalent as they are now. The digital format wasn't as prevalent as it is now. The structure's changed. And I'm extremely biased because I could be egotistical and say, well, me as radio or us as radio, saying that radio gave birth to podcasting. And that's all it is. It's just an outshoot of radio. So I would say that would be one difference.
I moved here in 1999 to start the Fox station, which is actually no longer here. There's a Starbucks in its place. But what was interesting when I came here in 1999, it was a very traditional media market. You had the ABC affiliate, the NBC affiliate, the CBS affiliate. You had the Idaho Statesman. You had the Idaho Press Tribune. Very traditional media, like it was basically in any market in the United States. And when we started Fox, it was revolutionary. I mean, because we were younger, so we were hipper, we did more in-depth stories. It was very interesting just being a part of something new like that. And over the years, I think seeing the evolution of media as a whole, not just here, but nationally. Even when I look at the television stations now and the relevancy or non-relevancy of that, right? Because the television news audience is getting older and older and older. I cannot tell you the last time I turned on the television and watched a local newscast. So, and I think that's happening to a lot of people because there are a lot more options. And to what Nate said, kind of specific genres of media, which I appreciate. I think with Idaho Ed News, with Idaho Capital Sun, with Boise Dev, there are these niches where I think reporters can really dig in and focus on certain topics and become experts in the field that they're covering instead of being called out on this story and that story. And you're kind of a jack of all trades, but you're not great at any particular piece of information. And I think with podcasts, I agree with Nate that absolutely radio, it was the precursor to podcast. But with that is also, non-traditional media sources, right? And that's something where there's been a lot of pushback, I think, from traditional media with new media, right? With people who are influencers. And I say, everybody, you need to figure out who you're listening to, right? To see if they're legit. But there are some really good non-traditional influencers who give great information. And for me, I just encourage people to have different sources of information. But yeah, the media environment here has changed exponentially. And I sometimes, wonder how much longer will we see even 3 television stations in this market? What's the need for that? What's the necessity for that? And maybe forever, but maybe not, and especially when we have news deserts, I think that's also something where even though media has changed a lot, so many small town newspapers have closed in Idaho, around the country. And so then people are relying on information that may not necessarily be as relevant to their community. And so I would hope that we start to maybe see more of that. And I do think something like Idaho Education News does a great job of covering, at least from an educational standpoint, these places that have news deserts because they cover the entire state. So it's definitely changed, but I'm kind of curious to see how it continues to evolve.
Our behavior's also changed as well.
Yeah.
Because somebody referenced 1998 earlier on. I think it was Mayor McLean. I just wish he didn't make it sound so long ago. But when I got here, I didn't have Facebook. I barely had a MySpace. And now we all have a handheld computer. And people go through the news, go through social media, and they're just flipping. And they're seeing a lot of headlines. And where radio is as intimate, I don't think really radio has changed much in the way we present ourselves. It's just intimate. We're in the homes, we're in the cars, we're in the garages, and I don't think our behavior has changed that much. Where you see a lot of click-driven media now. Once upon a time, I used to just go on a website and say, well, I think it was one media outlet had the most clicked or most viewed stories. And that was great for me. It's like, ooh, what are people listening? What are people clicking on? What are people caring about? Because if they're caring about it, I'm going to talk about it. And then they changed. So I actually had to do more show prep. And it's just difficult. So I will find myself now surveilling social media and spying on people, having as many friends as possible. What are people commenting on? Because now if they're commenting on it, I'm going to talk about it as well. That's if it's of interest to them, why is it of interest? What are their comments? Is this worthy to bring up on the show?
And while both of you guys have lived here for quite a while, you've worked in other places. Gemma, you've worked in Florida, Nate, Ohio. How would you say Idaho differs from those places you worked in terms of news and?
Well, I worked in Florida 20 years ago, so it was a very different environment. I would actually say Florida is quite similar to Idaho now. When I worked in Florida, we can just start with the fact that it was a swing state. And I covered the 2004 presidential election. You're never going to do that in Idaho. There's no need to. But in Florida, it was fascinating to cover a presidential election where how Florida would swing went down to Pinellas and Hillsborough County, which is the Tampa Bay area, which is where I worked. And so you're interviewing the presidential candidates, you are interviewing their surrogates, you are on the campaign trail in Florida because they are there constantly. That was a fascinating experience, not just from a professional standpoint, but from a personal standpoint. Also in Florida, a lot of things happen in Florida, good and bad, a lot of things. So the type of news that I covered in Florida a lot of times makes national headlines. So I covered the return to flight for NASA after the Columbia disaster. We covered that. I don't know if anybody remembers Terry Schiavo. She was in Pinellas County, and that happened right literally in my station's backyard. We covered that story. So it was really, even though it was local news, there was so much national attention to what happened in Florida that it gave me a really different perspective on, frankly, how you cover news as a whole and how it impacts people, maybe even if they're not in your community. But I would say now there's probably more similarities, but that was 20 years ago. So it gave me a better appreciation of living and working in a place like Boise versus living and working in a place like Florida. I feel like Florida, great, but it's an interesting place.
Cleveland was an interesting town, still is. Nashville was the most cosmopolitan place I had ever worked in as far as radio goes, but still with an older edge to it. Alabama was a place I personally never want to visit again.
I feel the same way about Florida.
But as far as the media outlet goes, I try to keep an eye on a number of people I worked with in Cleveland, worked with in Nashville, worked with in Alabama, and it kind of breaks my heart personally when I see so few of them left, and that's just a lot of the corporate structures that some of us work in, and that's just the way it is. As far as the outlet changes and news changes and skins, but Idaho is quite possibly one of the most intimate places I've ever been as far as the newsmakers having the willingness to come in with an open door policy and actually call you out on that when they actually just show up and say, hey, I had something to say and just figured I'd swing by. You don't see that in Cleveland. You don't see it in Nashville. You don't see it in Birmingham so much. The other part that I really enjoy is I don't have to worry about severe weather here, severe weather coverage at all. That Birmingham was terrible. I can't imagine what you went through in Florida.
Oh yeah, we covered, 2004 to 2006 hurricanes. So yeah, the most historic hurricane seasons on record.
And that's part of the intimacy of it. When the power goes out, your radio is still battery operated. So, right? I'm sorry, I had a Walkman on my desk a couple weeks ago, and I actually had somebody work at the radio station ask me what it was. So, again, I felt old. But as far as the media outlet changes, from then to now, we're talking about years later. You see different TV formatics You see different digital news outlets as well spring up since I've left, just to give me an eyesight, a vision into what's going on in my hometown or a place I lived. So Idaho's really unique in that, in growing in that as well, because even though we talked a little bit about the fractured media coverage, it's still very intimate as far as the coverage goes.
I would absolutely agree with you on that. And that is one thing where anywhere I've worked, in any section of the country, there is something unique about this market where you have access to not just newsmakers, but lawmakers, right? The people in power, you have access to in a level that you would never have access to in a much bigger market. And that is very unique, and I think it allows us to really be able to dive deep into issues because we have that access. I mean, I think you have to form relationships, right? You can't just be a brand new reporter and expect to have those relationships, and that does take time. But there really is that intimacy that you don't necessarily get in other markets.
Would that be one of the reasons that you guys maybe chose to stay in Idaho? Because you both choose to move here, and you've been here for a while. So why did you each decide to stay?
I thought I'd be here for 2 years and leave.
Same.
That was the plan. And I always say I was here for like 4 years and I left for 2 years and then I came back. I think for me, a big part of it is I'm from the West Coast. I was born in Portland. I grew up in a little town called Chehalis in Washington. If you wonder where it is, it's 80 miles south of Seattle, 80 miles north of Portland. And my whole family is on the West Coast. And Boise was the closest I had ever lived to home. And I will say, I think Boise was a very difficult place to acclimate to when I first moved here. People think they're friendly. They get friendly the longer you're here. And I really thought from a career standpoint, this was a stopover. And I got a lot of clarity working in Florida. It's such a large media market level. And when I decided to come back to Boise, I had offers at other, at other markets. And my husband was born and raised in Boise, and he boomeranged. I mean, he lived many places, came back, and was nice enough to move with me to Florida after he had moved back to Boise when we were still dating. And after 2 years in Florida, it really was just this thing where we were like, where do we want to live? Like, we were getting married, we knew we wanted to have a family, and it was, where do we want to live? It was no longer about where do I want to work, what do I want to do, where do I want to live? And for both of us, Boise was just that place. I think there is just something uniquely special about this region. And no matter our politics, no matter any of that, I think we have more similarity in the fact that we want to live in a really great community, and we all want to push our community forward to make it the best it can be. And so for me, it was a really personal decision to come back and to be here. And we've been back for 18 years. We got, I just remember when I got married. And we're raising our kids here. And I think it's a really amazing place to raise kids. The one thing, just an anecdote, so my oldest goes to the Y all of the time. And in the 8th grade, he started going to the Y. He'd walk from school to the Y. And then he'd want to kind of wander around downtown with his friends. And I remember looking at my husband, and I was like, I would never let him do this if we lived in Seattle or Portland or Tampa, or I would just, but he's just walking around with his friends downtown. And you can do that. You can let your kids do that and kind of have that urban experience and know that for the most part, they're going to be safe. Now, he did walk home one day without telling us. And so we were looking for him for a couple of hours. So we had to have a conversation about, you need to tell your parents where you're going. But the fact that he could walk 3 miles home and be totally safe. So so again, just a very personal reason to move back and to create a life here. But I also think that highly informs what I do for a living, because I truly am a part of this community. I don't just work here. When I talk about issues, they impact me. I am raising a family here. I'm highly invested in this community. And it's important to me to truly, deeply be a part of this community.
It's a great answer. Mine's not as good. I didn't even realize I applied here when I got a call from KBOI. I was on the beach, which is a term that a lot of people in media use when they've been fired or no longer working in media.
Listen, if you haven't been fired in media, you haven't succeeded.
Exactly. So I had to, oh Lord, I had to send out CDs to a number of different media outlets. CDs are round discs that have audio on. And I just looked for a bunch of openings all across the country and found myself here. And I actually had to look it up. And then I had the kind of data load of everything that was going on in Idaho. What do I know about Idaho? I applied for a job here. There's a thing going on with the senator. The field's blue. There's potatoes. And that was my Idaho knowledge. As yes, I glossed over something. I understand that, but I had that in my head, and then I got here, and it's really unheard of in this climate for a commercial news talk station to have two local shows in a market the size of Boise. At the time, was in the 104 in 2007. And since then it grew. But I also couldn't have been blessed more if I had just won the lottery, because Paul J. Schneider was the morning guy at the time. And he, went out to breakfast, and he ribbed me, but he was also as truthful as possible, where, he had been there at the time 40 some years, and he had watched Boise grow up around him, and it was he just loved it, and he had Chicago roots, so that was kind of the bonding that we had. And I mean, nobody at the time Boise was more Idaho, I would still argue still is, than Paul J. Schneider. I mean, he was just a giant media personality, and he made me fall in love with Boise, looking at it through his eyes. Media is very nomadic. There's a number of people who aren't from here or that are in media now that don't want to be here. Paul J. looked at me and said, "What's the difference between a doctor here or a doctor in New York City? Doctor's a doctor. You could be here and be the king of the world, or you can be somewhere else and just be another person in media." And it's phenomenal. The talking about the downtown scene, talking about watching an actual area grow, because you've had so many conversations, and I get to have them too. I remember what the intersection of Fairview and Eagle was like before the village, and then you just watch this place grow up around you, and then you find yourself in a realm, since we have a microphone or a camera, telling people what the way things used to be and or how things used to be, but it's neat is the only way. Also, I found a spouse who is a lot more successful than I am in media, and she keeps me grounded here as well. But I also don't find myself looking for other opportunities to leave. This is it. I've won the media lottery, and I'm gonna ride it until the wheels fall off, or until they tell me not to.
And one thing that I appreciate about both of your shows is that you guys try to steer people toward the facts, even if they don't agree. And Nate, several times I've heard you tell a caller that they're wrong, for instance. So how do you balance audiences who might have a level of distrust in the media with trying to ensure them that you're telling them the truth?
You don't care. Sorry, flippant answer. If somebody's wrong, if somebody were to tell me right now that it is snowing outside, it's not. Now, it might be snowing somewhere else, but if it's snowing right outside of this window, I have a responsibility. Just, okay, I I can deal with people's emotions, and I can deal with people's passion, and I can deal with people's perceived biases. I have them. I would make the argument that everybody has them, but if there is a data point that is just factually incorrect, I would kind of put forth that I have a obligation, either as a commentator or a reporter, whichever hat I'm wearing at the time, is just to go, no, here's the facts. And you have a notion, or they might have read something online, or somebody shared something without fact checking it, and people just take that little nugget and they have it, and they hold on tight to it because it confirms their bias. But they also might be incorrect. And it's the balance is, there is the score and there's everyone else's thoughts. So while I might have mine, I still have to go back to the score. I still have to go back to the actual fact and go, well, this is the fact. Well, how do we change it? Well, you can't. It's a fact. So deal with it. And if you don't trust the media, why are you listening? So, but at the same time, there's some times where I look at media, or I watch different reports, or I watch different websites, and I go, that's an interesting take. That looks like a commentary disguised as an actual news report, and they are two different things. The people at Boise Dev are reporters, and there is nothing wrong with reporters. It is a noble profession. These people are to go into rooms and buildings and tell us what's going on in that room or building at the time. It's up to monkeys like me, who are commentators, to go, here's my opinion on that. That's it. The two should not really drift into each other. And I find myself watching a lot of TV, a lot of cable news sites, and they're not really reporters anymore. They're all commentators. Either they're a commentator on scene, or they're a commentator behind a desk, which is fine. Just be honest. You're a commentator. You're an editorial. That's all you are, and that's fine. But if somebody doesn't trust the media, okay. You're surrounded by it, so there's nothing wrong with questioning everything. And I think that's a lot of the frustration that people have with my audience, or a lot of talk radio audiences, where they just question everything, and then other people go, well, how could you question that? Quite easy. You just question everything. And it's frustrating to a point until you just listen to all of the questions, and you just have the conversation from there. Sorry, long answer.
Gemma?
Facts aren't feelings. Facts are the facts, and whether you like them or not. And I think in the culture and the climate that we live in right now, and that we've lived in for at least the last decade, there's been a lot of questioning facts. That's fine. You can question them, but they are facts. And I think that we have an obligation and a responsibility to give people facts. Again, whether you like them or not, you don't have to like them. You don't have to agree with the facts, but they're facts. And I think we have a responsibility, again, to tell people what the facts are. And, from there, hopefully you have broader conversation, but facts are facts. When it comes to people distrusting the news media, that's an age-old trope. Everybody wants to blame the media for everything. I've been doing this for 30 years. I don't remember a time where people liked the media. With that said, do we make mistakes? 100%. Absolutely. But I'll tell you what, when we make a mistake on our show, we take responsibility for it. If someone reaches out and says, hey, I really feel like this was a bit more one-sided, we do our best to try to bring in that other side. But we also respond to people. I appreciate that engagement. I think it's critically important that we have that open communication with people that listen. And I'll tell you this, the biggest complaint we get on our show is, well, why don't you have Republican lawmakers on? I'm like, because they don't want to come on. Because we ask all of the time. they don't want to come on. Now, they listen on a daily basis because they're the first ones to call us when they don't like a fact that we've talked about. And we welcome them on the show, and they still don't want to come on. I cannot control if they come on. I can't make them come on the show. So that's probably the biggest criticism that we get. But again, facts aren't feelings, and we have a responsibility to talk about the facts. And if that makes you believe that the media, and I think, there's just this overreaching idea of the media, and it's easy to blame the media. And as my dad always said, I have really big, broad shoulders, so I can carry a lot. So if you want to blame the media because it makes you feel better, then, go ahead. But we're not going anywhere. And I think that we are the ones who demand transparency from our people in power. We're the ones that hold people accountable in a way that an average person doesn't have the ability to do that. And so I think that's a lot of reason why sometimes there is pushback to, can you trust the media, or what's the media's agenda? My agenda is to, again, educate, inform so that you can make the decision that is best for you.
We want to thank BoiseDev.com and their sponsors, Regents Blue Shield of Idaho and ServPro of Boise, for allowing us to bring you a recording of their conference. It was called The Intersection: How Idaho and Idahoans Connect the Dots, and How Key Pieces of Idaho's Economy Fit Together. It featured Idaho Matters host Gemma Gaudette and KBOI radio host Nate Shelman, along with Gretchen Parsons, managing editor of BoiseDev.com. We'll put a link to the Intersection video on our website, BoiseStatePublicRadio.org. I'm Samantha Wright. We'll have more Idaho Matters right after this.
You've been listening to Idaho Matters from Boise State Public Radio. I'm Gemma Gaudette.
We could all use a little help navigating the news these days. The Consider This podcast wants to give you a hand. 6 days a week, we'll help you make sense of the day's biggest news story and what it means for you in less than 15 minutes. Listen now to the Consider This podcast from NPR.